Hi, my name is Jake Damle, and today I'll be doing the second of my required reading presentations for Urban Governance 305. It was on an article titled Minorities Are the Demographic Engine of Millennial Urban Growth from the Brookings Institute. So the primary theme of urban governance that I drew from this article was that young people moving into cities are much less white than previous generations of people moving into cities. And they are much less white than young people that live elsewhere in the country in suburban, exurb, or rural areas. And this contributes heavily to how we should think about urban governance. So there are several things that we want to learn from this article. The first would be just the basic premise that minorities are making up an increasingly important part of the urban fabric. That young people are increasingly non-white or part of other minority groups, and that therefore this trend is something that we need to consider whenever we're addressing an urban governance challenge. I would also like to emphasize that the failure to consider or address these needs of changing populations can have disastrous consequences. One example where we've seen this happening before with new residents coming into cities being primarily minority or different than existing populations was in the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to northern and Midwestern cities. For me personally, I learned a lot about the 1943 and 1967 Detroit riots because I'm from there, but I know that there were riots across the country, including in Chicago, New York's Harlem area, Watts, Los Angeles, and Springfield, Illinois. This one in Springfield, Illinois actually prompted the founding of the NAACP because it was so horrendous. Some other things that we should learn is that in urban planning, as we go forward into the new century, it will be important to consider the new racial ethnic dynamic that new people bring to the city. And that will be true across any urban issue that we want to tackle, whether or not it be transportation, housing, water, food, any of those, we will have to consider this new social dynamic that comes into play. It's important to note that millennials have a unique set of challenges because of their age as well as their race. These people are typically younger, they typically have higher levels of debt than older established populations, and they typically want different things from urban governance than older populations. And so it's this confluence of age and racial ethnic dynamics that we need to consider. And it's also important to understand that the growth of these groups is not even across the country. Some cities like San Antonio have very little, have a lot of millennial growth, but very little of that is because of minorities. In some cities like Detroit, the millennial population is actually more white than the existing population, whereas in cities like Los Angeles or Phoenix, the millennial population is much more a minority than the existing population. And so it's important to consider the local dynamics of the city that we're in when we're considering how to address urban governance challenges. So one national figure that's been at the forefront of dealing with urban governance issues and minorities is Eric Garcetti. He's the mayor of Los Angeles. Los Angeles is the second largest U.S. city. He has been heavily involved in overseeing the transition of the city towards a more representative government. Typically, the city government of Los Angeles was heavily white, and that's been changing over the last 5 years of his tenure. And he's made that a big part of his claims to success in the city. He personally is bilingual, and he's made the diversity of the city a key part of the image that he wants to project to the nation. Obviously, he's directly involved in urban governance because he's the mayor of the second largest city, and therefore he determines largely the image and what projects are undertaken by the city government. In that lane, he has re-emphasized city beautification projects because he's believed that new urban minorities have been shut out of these traditionally basic government programs, and he wants to go back to basics and essentially guarantee that all people in the city have access to these programs. And then on a national level, in tourism ads and in part of his, national campaign about what the city of Los Angeles means and what it represents, he's made diversity a key part of that, and he's really emphasized the number of urban millennials that he has moving into the city as part of the reason that Los Angeles is a great city. And so I think that he's really on the forefront of how to deal with and how to look at the increasing minority growth in cities. So I would say that I would say that the claim that the article makes that minorities are an important part of urban community is generally true. Most of the article deals with basic statistical information, so it's pretty hard to present counterpoints to that. It does a very good job, though, of covering what I spoke about earlier, that this change is not uniform, and that it is important to consider the statistical information wherever you are, regardless of what the overall larger trend is. My home city, Detroit, is an excellent example of that. People that are moving there that are younger are actually whiter than the city as a whole, and so that creates a very different kind of challenge and a very different perspective on issues than if the groups moving in are more minority than the groups already living there. So how does this affect us as a generation? Some of us are probably millennials. Some of us are probably Gen Z. We're right on that borderline. And most of us, given that we're in urban governments, probably plan, and we already live in Phoenix, probably plan on living in an urban area. And so this means that we personally are part of this change, and that we are more likely to be exposed to it and part of that change than most other people. If we, because of this class, go on to work in urban governance, this change will likely be the defining issue that we deal with. It is a cross-discipline issue, which means that whether or not we're working in a transportation sector or with water, housing, food, disease, public health, this new change will be something that we have to take on regardless of what field we specialize in. And so knowing the data behind it and knowing the implications of it are going to be critical to being successful at what we truly want to accomplish. Personally, I want to be a teacher in an urban area, and understanding the demographics of a classroom are critical to having success, because you need to know about the needs, the perspectives of the students that you're teaching if you want to be successful, because different demographics will lead to different perspectives on learning subjects, different demographics will lead to different needs of students, and different demographics will lead to different atmospheres in classrooms. And that's not me trying to stereotype, but it is a realistic part of being in education. And so as the demographics of classrooms change across the years, and as the demographics of classrooms are changing now, it'll be important for teachers to consider how those changing demographics play into how they want to teach. And I want to live in a big city. So as a resident of a big city, understanding how the world around me is changing will help me adapt to that new world and be happy with where I'm living. And that will be an important part of just my personal life going forward. So I hope that you found this presentation helpful, demonstrating how minorities are changing in urban cities, how young people are changing in urban cities, and what potential challenges it may play in urban governance, as well as our professional and personal lives. I hope that you find this video helpful, and I hope that you have a great day. Thank you.